Well, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is due to be speaking at the State Department. We'll bring you all of the context and all of that live when it happens. And of course, what's it all about? Well, the final US plane has taken off from Kabul. The war in Afghanistan is officially over. The confirmation came from the Pentagon within the past hour and a half, bringing to an end 2 decades of conflict and, of course, 2 weeks of chaos on the ground. A C-17 transport plane took off at 19:29 GMT and cleared Afghan airspace as the announcement was made.
I'm here to announce the completion of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the end of the military mission to evacuate American citizens, third country nationals, and vulnerable Afghans. The last C-17 lifted off from Hamid Karzai International Airport on August 30th, this afternoon, at 3:29 p.m. East Coast time. And the last manned aircraft is now clearing the airspace above Afghanistan. We will soon release a photo of the last C-17 departing Afghanistan with Major General Chris Donahue and the U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Ross Wilson, aboard. While the military evacuation is complete, the diplomatic mission to ensure additional U.S. citizens and eligible Afghans who want to leave continues.
Well, more than 100,000 people have left on US flights in just the past 2 weeks. But thousands of Afghans hoping to leave the country now under Taliban control are being left behind, including many who worked as US allies. Well, Rob McBride is joining us now live from Kabul. Rob, it's been a historic moment, but also a solemn moment.
Absolutely. I mean, this was some incredible scenes here in Kabul. What is a very historic night, finally the ending of 20 years of military involvement by the United States in the country. Word started to spread here very quickly, just after midnight local time. So we were already into the 31st of August, a date which is very important, which will be noted in history books in years to come. This was the date, the deadline set as the departure of the US, and the US was good to its word. It left on the 31st, but just after midnight into this day, Tuesday, and word started to spread on social media that the wheels up were on the last aircraft taking off from Hamid Karzai International Airport. We started to get some email traffic from the Taliban saying they were taking over control, confirming that the last of the American aircraft had left. Then we started, interestingly, to have something of an eerie silence. We'd for days now been hearing all sorts of aircraft noises of patrolling warplanes overhead. Earlier on Monday, we saw a B-52 bomber pass over Kabul, and then there's been this thundering background noise of these aircraft, big lumbering C-17s taking off, transport planes taking off from the airport as this evacuation has continued. And quite quickly, within about 10 minutes or so, as we started to get confirmation that the last of the Americans had gone, this noise started to drift away. There was something of an eerie silence, and then that was quickly replaced by this rolling gunfire, a building cacophony. It began at the airport itself. We started to see tracer gunfire firing up into the air, so it was obviously some sort of celebratory gunfire, and then very quickly this was picked up across the city as word started to spread up between Taliban groups and Taliban fighters in various locations, and very soon the whole of the skyline around the city was lit up with guns of all sorts of sizes and description firing into the air at this news that finally, after 20 years, the US have gone.
And Rob, there's been so much attention leading up to this deadline, this moment that has now come. But I suppose the inevitable question is what happens next? And of course, we're left with a pretty complex picture.
Absolutely. Well, for the Taliban themselves, they have to form a government. They've got a country to run. They unexpectedly almost inherited the country with the collapse of the Hamid Karzai, the previous Ashraf Ghani regime, very quickly collapsing 2 weeks ago. They found themselves in control here in Kabul, and very quickly they have had to run around and are still in the process of forming their government. There's no kind of of power sharing that we were talking about before. They are in charge, but they also inherit all of the myriad problems that comes with Afghanistan after decades of war, with all of the problems that it has encountered over the years. So it has really got its work to do. And the most important thing, there are a number of things on that list, but one of the priorities is at the airport itself. That was seeing the completion of the evacuation, dealing with the chaotic scenes there, and somehow putting an airport back together again. Remember, this is the airport at Kabul is just about the only entry and exit point that Afghanistan has really had for, the best part of 2 weeks, but it's been controlled by the US. Now the US is gone. They've taken air traffic control with it. They've pretty much left a shell of an airport there. It is now up to the Taliban, possibly with the help of foreign partner countries, to re-establish all of the systems that make an airport work, such as its air traffic control, its security, and all the rest. It has to do that. The land borders largely remain closed. It has thousands of people moving towards those land borders to try to get out of Afghanistan. So it has a brain drain to deal with. It has massive migrations of people. It has to somehow convince people to stay within the country. And then there are fears from the people themselves, of course, that all of these promises of this being a new type of Taliban regime, that it is a softer, more inclusive government, it doesn't mean much until people see that matched with actions. And a lot of people, as we know, simply aren't waiting. They are heading for land borders, and they will once they have the opportunity, it seems, and we have airports open and running again, be trying to get onto flights. And the other problem for the United States and for all of the people who still believe that they have a right to go to the United States, they believe they have a right to protection from the US to stop being stop reprisals from the Taliban as they take over because they have some sort of connection with the US military or other foreign forces. There is the problem of how the US, through diplomacy, through the State Department, can try to process those people to try to leave Afghanistan, to go to the US, or indeed to other countries such as the UK. That remains a huge problem that will require all sorts of diplomacy, cooperation from the Taliban government, who possibly will not want to contribute to what is a continuing drain on people leaving the country that it needs to make the country work. So there's an awful lot of problems ahead. The airport, the departure of the Americans, in some ways, despite all of the chaos and the trauma of the past couple of weeks, that was almost the more straightforward problem to resolve. We knew it was going to be resolved somehow and at some point, and it would be probably resolved on the 31st of August, which it has. Now, in many respects, for many different actors and partners in the ongoing Afghan crisis, the problems really start.
Rob McBride joining me there live from Kabul. Rob, thank you. Well, the US president says he will address his nation on Tuesday, but in the past few minutes, the White House has released a statement saying, the past 17 days has seen our troops execute the largest airlift in US history, evacuating over 120,000 US citizens of our allies and the Afghan allies of the United States. They've done it with unmatched courage, professionalism, and resolve. Now our 20-year military presence in Afghanistan has ended. Well, Gabe Elizondo was listening to the Pentagon briefing and joins me now live from Washington, D.C. Gabe, there was an extraordinary amount of detail and a level of frankness, wasn't there, in that briefing from the Pentagon earlier? Just bring us up to date with what happened in that briefing.
Yeah, that's right. Kenneth McKenzie, the general who's in charge of Central Command, was very frank after he announced that all U.S. troops had completely pulled out of the airport. He then followed that up by saying there's not one single U.S. service member still in Afghanistan. There was a lot in that briefing, but he confirmed that since August 14th, The U.S. military has helped evacuate 123,000 civilians, including about 6,000 U.S. citizens. He did say not all people that wanted to leave, they were able to get out. We're hearing from the State Department that they believe that there are still less than 250 U.S. citizens in Afghanistan that were not able to get to the airport. In the statement by Joe Biden that you just read, he went on to also say that Biden said that it was the unanimous conclusion from all of his top commanders that he should not extend the deadline past August 31st, and that is why the U.S. pulled out when it did. McKenzie, the general, also stating that the last military planes that left Hamid Karzai International Airport carried the top U.S. military general on the ground, as well as the top U.S. diplomat, the ambassador to Afghanistan. And once that plane left and it was wheels up, essentially at that point, the U.S. Military involvement had completely ended in Afghanistan in terms of any sort of troops or even diplomats, for that matter, on the ground. He was also very complimentary, quite frankly, towards the Taliban, saying that the Taliban were, in his words, and I'll get the exact words here, in his words, the Taliban were helpful and useful over the past several days and weeks in helping to secure the perimeter of the airport. He said that the threats against U.S. service members the last few days and weeks did not come at all from the Taliban, but instead were coming from ISIL-K. So clearly McKenzie felt complimentary of the Taliban and their cooperation, if you will. That cooperation did not go so far as to where the U.S. Told the Taliban in advance exactly when the last planes would be leaving the airport. He said they did not tell the Taliban that. In terms of ISIL-K, it was interesting. McKenzie said he believes that there are about 2,000 ISIL-K fighters still within Afghanistan. He insinuated that a lot of them were from the prisoners that were let out of some of the jails in Afghanistan. He feels some of them were from there, and he said that the Taliban would have their hands full dealing with ISIL-K in the coming weeks and months, quite frankly. Though, however, bottom line to all of this is the 20-year war in Afghanistan, or at least the 20-year presence of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, officially is now over.
Gabe Elizondo there joining us with the very latest live from Washington, D.C. Gabe, thank you. Well, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is expected